Hey everybody, welcome to the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pekolsky. Today we're going to dive a little bit into neuroscience, the science of making your brain work better, work faster, and one of the best new technologies that exists anywhere on the market. Today's guest is a graduate of biochemistry at University of California, Berkeley. He studied a master's in neuroscience at Stanford, and he got an MD at the Stanford School of Medicine. This guy's no slouch. He's been in the tech industry since 2002 when he left med school and has been crushing it ever since with success after success, all focused in this area of neuroscience and brain optimization. Transcranial stimulation is what we're going to look at today. What does that mean? Sending electricity into your brain to make it work better. I know that sounds a little bit scary to all of us. And to be honest, it was to me as well when I began. But after experimenting with this device for over 3 years, I finally feel comfortable to bring Dr. Daniel Chao on the show today to discuss the Halo Sport, which many of you have heard of. And every sports team, it seems, across the country is diving into this thing to optimize brain performance, brain function, and motor learning. And it is a device that looks very much like a headset that you put on your head, and it literally emits electrical impulse into your brain that is said to improve performance. Now, Dr. Chao and I discuss the safety first and foremost, because I know that's always going to be the hardest thing to overcome. And Dr. Chao has been working most of his adult life, if not all of his adult life, on optimizing this technology and now looking at different areas of the brain that may actually benefit from this acute electrical stimulus. And he'll tell you all about the protocols, how to get it. He's going to hook you guys up with an awesome discount code just for being listeners of the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. I hope you all are living an amazing life. I hope you're thriving. I hope you're upgrading yourself every day, both physically and mentally. And you know, as always, challenge what you think you know, because it seems as though so many of us are stuck in this fixed mindset, this fixed paradigm that really needs to be challenged. And the idea of sending electrical impulses into your brain is absolutely a challenging thing to wrap your head around, but it's absolutely something that may benefit you. Now, this is not saying I'm getting behind this and telling you this is 100% safe, but Dr. Chao is the CEO of this company, and he gives us extensive data and extensive validation around why thousands and thousands of people across the US and Canada and Europe are using this device and seeing massive benefits. And the cool thing is it's not that expensive, and you guys will enjoy the benefits when you try it out. Just before we get rolling on this podcast, I want to talk to you a little bit about sleep and one of my favorite sleep hacks that I'm actually using right now as I sit in my hotel room in Dubai. After a long trip, 13 hours on a plane, it's often very, very difficult to get to sleep. And the first thing that I go to, whether I'm trying to optimize my sleep or I feel like I'm getting a little bit run down, is reishi mushroom. 3 grams of reishi mushroom before bed is one of my favorite means of calming my nervous system, calming my mind, and helping me get into a deep state of sleep, especially when I'm traveling or just when I know I've had a stressful day and have a hard time turning off. You guys know I've been a massive fan of Four Sigmatic for a long time. They've been a long-time supporter of this podcast, which allows me to bring you all this amazing free information from best guests around the entire planet. And I love Four Sigmatic. So I want you guys to head over to foursigmatic.com/muscle and pick up some reishi mushroom, some lion's mane mushroom. Four Sigmatic is hooking you guys up if you use the code MUSCLE when you go over to foursigmatic.com. Now, support myself, support the show, and support Four Sigmatic for putting out such great products that support our health in a natural way. And enjoy the show with Dr. Daniel Chao. Dr. Daniel Chao, welcome to the show. I would love to hear a little bit about your background. Your pedigree is absolutely phenomenal, but if you could tell us, I know you're a MD and Master of Science from Stanford.
Yeah, so happy to talk about my background, though I wouldn't recommend my career path to anybody.
Why is that?
Well, I'll tell you first, and then I think it'll become obvious. There are a couple of twists and turns along the way, but I don't know. I think I'm thankful for everything, but it wasn't the most direct path. So basically, in summary, I've been a brain nerd since the time I was a very young child. Just fascinated by the brain, and I was inspired by the decade of the brain, which was the 90s, famously coined by George H.W. Bush. Studied it in college, went to UC Berkeley for that. Then after that, went to graduate school. As you mentioned, I went to Stanford, and there I got my medical doctorate and a master's in neuroscience. And I still remember this day. It was this class called pharmacology. It was like a really big, important class in medical school. And, it didn't take me long to realize that when people talk about the miracle of modern medicine, they're really talking about drugs. And like just how amazing and life-changing and life-extending they could be. You take a little pill once a day and magically your cholesterol's lower. Take a little pill once a day, magically your blood pressure's lower. Take a pill and amazingly, this infection that could have killed you 100 years ago, like you decide to go to work the next day, no big deal.
Right.
But then when you get to the chapter on drugs for the brain, and this is what I was really interested in learning, the wheels fall off. Drugs for the brain, there's this, like in terms of the therapeutic value that you get. So the amount of efficacy versus the amount of side effects that you have to endure, that ratio, if you compare drugs for the brain versus drugs for other parts of the body, is about as bad as it gets. I mean, it's down there with cancer drugs. Mm-hmm. And I guess that was really disappointing to me. I mean, here I am as this neuro guy and just really hungry to learn more about neuroscience and the brain and, especially how drugs work for the brain. And you get to this and you get to it. And, what you learn is that they're like, it's actually, extremely subpar compared to its peers. So, I asked the question, what if we were to start over? Like, let's pretend that the drug industry didn't exist and pharmacies and pharmacists and, the prescription pad, like if you take a step back, like there's this whole system and industry built around delivering drugs, which the United States has gotten really, really good at. And I think it clouds our perspective. So like, what if we were to just take a step back and forget all of that existed? Like, how would you go about it? And I thought like maybe the way is to use electricity to retune the brain. With electricity, it relies on a physical device. And with a physical device, there's a lot of advantages over a drug. So, I know probably not yourself, Ben, but maybe many of your listeners will, they'll read about my bio and they'll read about my company, and it's a brain stimulation company. And, their first reaction might be like, wow, that is crazy. But like, I hope your listeners will, give me a chance to, like explain the story. And, I hope by the end they will agree with me, or at least start thinking about the status quo and how broken it is.
Sure. I think the audience is used to my always challenging their beliefs and challenging my own beliefs. And I think, you would agree that putting a drug into, or at least a drug that crosses the blood-brain barrier, likely has even greater implications than a low-level electricity. And, from my perspective, talking to what you said there around pharmacology being so far behind when it comes to the brain, it's this scenario where you're robbing from Peter to pay Paul, right? You're putting something in, you're getting this massive negative side effect. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that we can ever overcome that in the brain, right? Like obviously maybe at some point in the future we could do it, but it seems as though when you push one thing up, your brain is always going to counteract with something else. And that's why I got so interested in your device, was because, again, that was one of the major questions I wanted to ask was like, if we start pushing this electrical stimulation into the brain, first of all, like, I'm sure you're going down this path, but like, what happens? Like, and obviously we know the brain's an electrical structure and we're going to increase transmission, but is that going to potentially lead to a greater metabolic response, greater metabolic requirements? Is it going to lead to downstream negative repercussions in some way?
Yeah. So Ben, you said a lot of things there, and let me just let's talk about all of them actually. So you started off by saying something really interesting, and I couldn't agree with you more. In that, taking a little pill and expecting that chemical to get through the gut into your blood and go to your brain, not the whole brain, but just a small part of the brain, which is where it's needed. That is impossible.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it gets into your blood, and it does a lap. This little chemical does a lap around all of your vital organs, like kidney, liver, spleen, heart, lungs, unnecessarily, and potentially, well, not potentially, very much so, creating side effects along the way. And then there's this thing called the blood-brain barrier, which you mentioned, which is very important. So the blood-brain barrier is this, it's like this filter, and it only allows certain molecules to pass through this filter because the brain is a very delicate organ and it needs a protected circulation, which we all want. Now, for a drug to get through this, the sort of bioavailability to the brain is actually very low. So what that means is the strategy is to kind of overdose the blood so that the small amount of drug can pass through the blood-brain barrier and enter the brain. Okay, so that's not good. Okay, so now let's talk about the small amount of drug that does make it to your brain. Well, you can't expect this little chemical to go to the exact right part of the brain at the exact right time, right? That's impossible. So this thing is just floating around in a chemical soup, and whatever it sticks to, that's where it acts. So it similarly goes all over the place in the brain unnecessarily. And so, without being a neuroscientist or a medical doctor, you can understand why drugs for the brain don't work very well. It's a problem of targeting, right? There's like, you take it by mouth, it goes to your blood. You do a lap around all the major organs before a small amount makes it to your brain. It goes all over the place in the brain. Like, all of this is friendly fire.
Mm-hmm.
So, with a neurostimulator, we can get around a lot of those problems. So, with the neurostimulator, which is what my whole career has been based on, we could use a physical device where we can take advantage of this thing called an electrode. And an electrode we can put exactly where we want, and importantly, leave the rest of the body and the brain alone. Also importantly, an electrode you can turn on and off at your leisure. So you turn it on when you need it, and you turn it off when you don't need it. That is impossible for a drug. Like, you take a drug and you're kind of stuck with it. You can't turn the thing off. So this was an idea that I had in medical school that, if we were to start over and forget the pharmaceutical industry, our approach to the brain might be radically different, and it might be based on using neurostimulation or, bioelectric therapy. Okay, so that's one thing that you mentioned that was really important, and I want to get to this concept of zero sum too, which you also talked about. But yeah, Ben, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to ask kind of one clarification question, but I can absolutely hold off until you finish that thought.
All right, so this idea of zero sum, if you push one thing up, it's like a teeter-totter. If you push one side up, necessarily the other, something else, somewhere else needs to go down. Now, that question has been asked in using neurostimulation for the brain and studied, and it hasn't been described. Like, there isn't any data that describes that there's this zero sum concept. So, with the case of Halo Sport, and we're going to talk a lot about Halo Sport in a second, but just a sneak peek. Halo Sport is our first product, and it is a motor cortex neurostimulator. If you use it combined with movement training, our promise to our users is that they will learn that movement faster. Now, yourself and others, scientists have asked, like, okay, if you do this, does something else happen that goes down? And to the extent that it's been studied, it hasn't been described. But let me just, if you allow me some latitude, I I think in athletics, it's understood that some things are zero sum, like when things go up, other things go down,
Mhm.
and yet it's a conscious trade off. Like, for example, I'm really into cycling, and it's understood that if you train to be a better sprinter, you will be a worse climber because if you're a sprinter, it's about like short periods of like bursty power, and to do that, you need bigger muscles. And if you have bigger muscles, then you generally weigh more, which which makes you a worse climber. So if you have a 3,000, 4,000 foot climb, at some point your mass is going to be a disadvantage to someone who's lighter. For a basketball player, you look at someone who's tall and plays in the paint. Strength is to their advantage, and they're willing to be stronger at the expense of quickness. Now, a point guard would not want that. So, in terms of like athleticism, I think there are these known trade-offs, and to the extent that neurostimulation plays into that, then I don't think there's any stopping that. I think there is something like there is like hopefully it's not completely zero sum. Hopefully there's some lift on both sides, although there is some up and down. But I think in athleticism there is this understanding of trade-offs when you start training for something.
Sure. I think when it comes to the brain, though, that ambiguity, even the possibility of having some negative repercussions on something, is a very frightening scenario for some people, right? Like, what am I possibly going to lose to experience a little bit of upregulation of skill acquisition or upregulation of maybe speed of processing, right? So that uncertainty, I'm sure, is something you guys have begun to study.
Yes, yes, and I should mention it's us, but it's also a community of scientists that are interested in these exact questions. So, maybe I should take a step back and talk to yourself and the listeners about the history of neurostimulation, because although this might be our first conversation about neurostimulation, the field has existed for several decades.
Yeah, a long time.
Yeah, so there's been the use of our flavor of neurostimulation, so-called non-invasive neurostimulation, that's been around for a while. But there's been so-called invasive neurostimulation. So these are for medical applications where electrodes are surgically implanted in the brain, connected to a pulse generator that's implanted under the skin. So this is think of this as like a pacemaker for your brain, not for your heart but for your brain. And these have been available to people that have Parkinson's disease, chronic pain, epilepsy, tremor. So these types of neurologic disorders, folks with these disorders have benefited from so-called invasive neurostimulation for over 20 years. And in looking at these folks, this is a far more severe form of neurostimulation. Like, these folks are getting stimulated invasively 24/7 for years on end. Many of these people for over a decade. And in terms of like side effects or zero sum, things going up, improving while other things getting worse, the trade-offs are very moderate. There's the side effects beyond the risk of the surgery are actually very low. So my last company, we built like a pacemaker for the brain to treat epilepsy. It's a company called NeuroPace, and there's thousands of people with our system installed, so surgically implanted in the brain. Many of these people have been using our product, benefiting from our product for over 10 years. And, if anything, the device is working better with time. So, with especially the brain, many people think like, oh, okay, you take this drug and you need more and more to get the same benefit. But that isn't true with neurostimulation. like in neurostimulation, and certain in the experience of my last company, the results, the 10-year results are better than the 1-year results.
Very interesting. I'm really interested in that, Dr. Chao. That's one question I wanted to really dig into.
Oh, please call me Dan, by the way.
Okay. Dan, sorry, I apologize.
No, don't apologize.
The implications of like subjecting your body or your brain to any type of electrical stimulation. What has research shown that actually happens? Like, I think you're kind of going down answering this question anyways, but like, I'm always kind of cautious about, hey, we're going to subject your body to this, and whether or not we're seeing an upregulation, downregulation, or kind of a deteriorating effect or an upregulated effect from these, ultimately transcranial direct stimulation.
Yeah. So what's going on here, and what are the potential safety risks? That's I think that's maybe the most important question of this entire podcast. So yeah, let's dig in. So the technology is called transcranial direct current stimulation. The field in its modern form started about 15 years ago. And in 15 years, we quickly ramped up to over 4,000 peer-reviewed scientific publications. So, I would call it a fairly well-studied but new field. Mm-hmm. The way it works is you take an electrode and you put it on your scalp over a part of the brain that you want to affect. You turn on the stimulator for about 20 minutes. And what that does is it induces this temporary state of hyperlearning in the underlying part of the brain. So this state of hyperlearning lasts for about an hour. So in the case of Halo Sport, we're stimulating the part of the brain that controls movement. And what we ask our users to do is to stimulate, this so-called motor cortex for 20 minutes. And then feed the brain repetitive training repetitions, like deliberate, thoughtful training repetitions, quality training repetitions for the next hour. And the result is that you will learn that movement at an accelerated rate. All right. So what we're doing is we're applying this 20-minute session of neurostimulation. In the case of this form of neurostimulation, so-called TDCS, it relies on a direct current, a very mild direct current, so between 1 and 2 milliamps. This amount of current produces an electric field that is strong enough to get through the skull while gently interacting with just very superficial layers of cortex. So, I'll come back to that in a second, but just shelf that as an important point. Mm-hmm. So it's a very mild amount of stimulation, and the mildness is a blessing and a curse all in one. So it is a blessing because that is probably why it is so damn safe. And we'll talk about the safety data in just 1 minute. But the flip side of that is that we can't go very deep with this technology. So there are deeper brain structures that are interesting that I would love to stimulate, but frankly, TDCS will never be strong enough to hit those targets. So, fortunately, there's plenty of superficial targets that are like very interesting and have powerful connections throughout the brain that we're excited to modulate. Motor cortex being exhibit A, but the downside is that we can't target those deeper structures.
Just from negligence of user, or just lack of efficacy in studies?
Part of it, the biggest part of it is just the physics of the technology, that we would have to turn it up to a level that would just be, like, from a comfort perspective, basically intolerable.
Right. So
you're a user of Halo Sport, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Mm-hmm. But if you use it at level 10, for most people that's okay. But for other people, there's the sensation is too intense.
Oh, for sure. Yep.
And so you can imagine if there was a level 20, that would be too intense for just about everybody.
I think it may be the type of thing where you'd have an attenuation. Does that seem reasonable? Like you'd kind of become desensitized to it?
There is some. And like for most people, like as they continue to use it, they're like, oh, that's no big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And they can go up in intensity. For many people, like level 10 is fine from session 1 and like
Right.
more power. But, for other folks, they start at level 5 or level 6. And then, after 5 or 6 uses, they're like, oh, that's no big deal. And, they can go up higher. But, to just like finish the thought on safety, with safety, to me, like any discussion around safety should be a discussion around data. So the data from those 4,000 publications, they all point to a very, very safe technology. There isn't, there hasn't been any description of like let's just have some fun. Like, what could go wrong? Could you have mood changes, like be depressed or manic? Well, that hasn't been described. Could you get like cancer or something, like, what a cell phone would produce? Like that hasn't been described. Like a stroke or a blood clot of some sort, that hasn't been described. Memory issues, balance issues, like none of that has been described. Like folks have looked hard, deliberately, like proactively asking like questions, not just soliciting unprompted responses. We've also done that. Like, we've tested several thousand people at this point in randomized controlled studies, and we can't find anything. And, if there's any single organization on Earth that has as much data as we do, like I don't think there is any single organization on Earth that has as much data as we do, because we've got tens of thousands of these headsets out in the wild. We recently crossed 250,000 successful neurostimulation sessions.
Wow.
And, our users are like, they're using it and they're not having, like any of the side effects that I think are really hypothetical without any data that supports these hypotheses. So, we're confident that this is a safe product.
So staying on the safety realm, have you guys experimented with using it on other areas of the brain, or is this something you guys are concerned with other people, trying it at home and throwing it on, the back of the brain, the front of the brain, and potentially experimenting with different effects in different areas?
So the Halo Sport, the recommended use is to target the motor cortex. It's built for the motor cortex. Now, your question around like, what if you tilt it forwards or backwards? Like you could target a different brain region. And we 100% know this is happening. If the user is a skilled user, like there are many folks that are self-proclaimed biohackers and, and they're interested in targeting a different brain region, then by all means, like have fun, give it a try. We have scientists that have partnered with us, and also like like not necessarily scientists, but they're working in skilled organizations that want to try targeting different brain regions with Halo Sport by tilting it forwards or backwards. We're happy to support these so-called power users in that endeavor, because there are other brain regions that have been studied with excellent data. Not to spill company secrets, but we're interested in many of these targets, and you could expect new products from Halo that are built specifically to target these new areas, right? So you don't have to, wear Halo Sport in kind of this goofy way. You could have a special headset that's designed to target a different part of the brain. And, we're really interested and, actively building, our next generation neurostimulator that'll do just that. But yeah, if there's, if folks are interested in targeting other brain regions and, they're skilled and, they're ready to kind of take ownership of going off the grid, then by all means.
Good to know there's no safety concerns there. So Dan, talk to me about the performance measures here. So if somebody throws on the Halo for 20 minutes, hits the gym or whatever their endurance or their event happens to be, what have you guys seen as far as like actual quantitative response? Like have you started to quantify or even qualify any of the potential implications?
Yeah, love this question. So there's the I'll answer it in two ways. So one, we are thankful and forever indebted to the scientific community that preceded us. So we founded the company in 2013. And by then, there were already several hundred articles written about TDCS and targeting different brain regions, getting different effects, all excellent, well-controlled trials. And to the credit of these scientists, they gave us the courage to found Halo. Now, since founding the company, many of these scientists are now our friends and users of our products, which is amazing. It's one of the great joys of my job. Now, with collaborative efforts with these labs and also with our own lab. So I should mention that we have 7 neuroscientists on staff, and we do our own original science. We're like really happy to like join forces with the scientific community to help advance the frontier of what we know. So how do you do research generally in this field to figure out what's going on? So let's take weightlifting, because that's topical for this audience. You would take a group of people and divide them into two. Half of them get neurostimulation. The other half get fake neurostimulation. We call this the sham group. So this fake neurostimulation, the amount of neurostimulation feels like the real thing, but it actually doesn't work. So the cool thing is that everybody thinks they're getting the real thing, but in actuality, only half of them are. So these subjects that are enrolled in the study are so-called blinded, right? So they don't know which group they're in. And the researchers conducting the study are also blinded, so they don't know which group people are in. So everybody's treated equally. What you do is you do some baseline testing. You do a bunch of training with real or sham neurostimulation. And then you do some post testing. So you compare baseline to post. And what you would expect to see is that in the sham group, that they would see some lift in the performance metric. And you would expect that because with any amount of training, heck, you did some training, you should be like, you should see a little bump in performance. Okay. And we would see that. But in the stimulated group, if you believe the technology works, you would see a level of performance above and beyond the control group. This has been tested like multiple times on over, hundreds of times over. And the tests show, and I'm just going to like restrict my answer to just the motor cortex studies, that we could accelerate the rate of motor learning, movement learning by about 50% over the control group. Now, in terms of performance, like what does that mean? Because at the end of the day, if you want this to be part of your training arsenal, what could you expect?
Sure. So just one question to clarify. Yeah. That's 50% acutely or over time?
So it's a 50% gain in the rate of learning.
Okay. So immediately.
Right. So the rate of learning.
Are you using like a Stroop test? Is that what you guys are? I think I saw you guys using as far as the rate of learning. Like how are we quantifying rate of learning?
So there's a lot of different ways, and you wouldn't use the Stroop test for motor cortex. So the Stroop test, for those that don't know, it's you'd have a right arrow and the word left, and you would have to say if this is congruent or not, and you try to like mix these signals up, and the better you are at detecting whether these are congruent or incongruent, the better your result. And this is a test of more cognitive function. What we're talking about is the motor cortex, which is all about movement. Yeah. So there's all kinds of different ways you could test the motor system. So there's things that you could test in terms of fine motor control. So you could, for example, on a computer, you can test how accurate folks are with a mouse. So you basically go target hunting with a mouse, and you can measure that. That might be interesting to a video gamer, but to this audience, it's probably less interesting. So there's other things you could do to, say, test for strength. There's something called MVC, maximum voluntary contraction, and you can measure that safely in a lab with these different force gauges. So the one that we like tests grip strength. Grip strength is testing muscles in your forearm, and you could do that in a way that isn't particularly dangerous to the research subject. And it's actually it's still relevant. Like grip strength is relevant to a lot of different sports.
Sure it is.
So ourselves and others have studied maximum voluntary contraction using grip strength, and frankly other forms of maximum voluntary contraction. And we can show that we could see an improvement in MVC if you train with neurostimulation versus not. For endurance athletes, there's different ways that you could test this, and there's these really brutal tests that's called time to exhaustion. So you basically put these people on, say, a stationary bike, and you increase the load by 50 watts or whatever step you want every 30 seconds, and you have the subject just keep pedaling until they're so tired they fall off the bike. And you mark that time. And if you train with neurostimulation, you could extend the time to exhaustion versus if you trained with fake neurostimulation. So there's different ways that you can measure, but the studies that we pay the most attention to, and the studies that we conduct ourselves, are these ones that are so-called double-blinded, randomized controlled trials.
Very good. Thank you for that. So one question I threw at you earlier that I'd love to just kind of dig into is are you guys doing pre and post QEEGs on any of the subjects, like in-house or any of the researchers?
So could I take that question more broadly? So you mentioned EEG, which is a way to electrically visualize the brain. But there are other ways to visualize the brain. Like you can use infrared, you can use MRI, PET scanning. So there's a variety of different modalities that you can use to image the brain, EEG being one very good one. So though we like EEG, we also realize its limitations. So EEG is a really noisy way of collecting data from the brain. And the noise comes from the atmosphere, like electromagnetic signals from the atmosphere. The noise comes from muscles in our face and our eyes. So we like EEG, but we generally don't use it in our lab. We prefer this other modality that uses infrared. And, we could absolutely see activation in the cortex that we are stimulating using infrared versus other parts of the brain that aren't being treated. And beyond that, so our lab isn't really set up to do MRI, but other labs are. And there's been multiple studies now published looking at, these more sophisticated, but admittedly more expensive forms of imaging the brain. And using those technologies, you can also detect a change.
Would that be something you can actually test in real time because it's infrared and the QEEG wouldn't be affected by the electrical stimulation?
With infrared, you can test it in real time. So we actually have a rig set up where we can put the sensor right in the middle of the electrode, which is kind of cool. And we can see these changes in real time.
Very interesting. Have you guys looked at any changes in like the metabolic response of the brain cells, the tissues, or the neurotransmitter response? Is that something you're able to test yet?
There's the way to do that would be in animal studies, where you can be like far more invasive than you could with human testing. So, we understand our place in science. What we call is we're translational science. So we're trying to take scientific equipment, and figure out like how can we apply this in a consumer landscape. Now, those more deeply mechanistic studies that you're asking about, like we understand that's not our place in science. That's based for universities that are set up with MRI scanners and PET scanners and all of this like very expensive specialized equipment that frankly, as a for-profit company, that will never be like our place in science. Like our place in science is the final mile.
I understand. I was just curious how, sending any electrical stimulation through your brain is actually impacting all of it, right? From a chemistry perspective, from a neurotransmitter perspective, like what's actually happening. And is there data out there, like outside of your company? Is there data out there on this stuff?
There is some. It's an animal work, and there are neurotransmitter effects, as you would expect, right? You would expect increases in signaling, and you would especially on the physiology side, you can measure the excitability of the cortex using these pulses produced by a TMS magnet. So I won't get too into that because that's kind of a tangent. But suffice it to say, you can use what are called evoked potentials to test how excitable the cortex is. And after 20 minutes of neurostimulation, you can see that these evoked potentials are potentiated. So for a given pulse, the result is a much bigger signal after you stimulate with TDCS. So these are some of the classic studies that came out in like 2003, 2004 from Nietzsche and Paulus over in Germany. Sort of the godfathers of the modern version of this field, and they describe this change in physiology, and that's really what sparked interest and has cascaded into over 4,000 publications.
Very, very interesting. Now, you guys are relaunching the Halo 2. Can you tell me a little bit about how that's differentiating from the first one you put out?
Yeah, so Halo Sport version 1 was launched about 3 years ago. And Ben, I got to thank you for being one of our early customers.
Yeah, I tell you, I'm fascinated with this stuff, and anytime we can kind of get that edge, and I'll tell you, not just the fact you're on here, I definitively see a difference, and the biggest difference I saw, subjectively, obviously, was the time to peak performance was a fraction of what it normally otherwise been, right? So if I could, example, lift 600 pounds, it would normally take 30 minutes to get to that point, whereas with or maybe longer than that, whereas with the Halo, it was a fraction. So that's the difference I saw. I just felt like as soon as I was done my priming, I was ready to go, and I can almost go to peak output right away. I don't know if you've seen stuff like that with other athletes. I see the benefit of that with really any sport. It's like cutting down your warm up time, or even improving the efficacy of your warm up would be massively beneficial.
Yeah, we hear that a lot. And we also, I think we hear it from the weightlifting community more so than other communities, because I think it's just more obvious in your form of training, because it's just more acute. You're more acutely aware of, because you're looking at a number, like how much are you moving? Right.
I think it's more of a subjective thing though. Like I just feel like things are turned on. I feel like, if I was a golfer, I feel like putting this thing on my head before I golfed would be like, those days where you go in and, as a cyclist, you get those days you go in and you just feel good. You're not sure why. You can't really put a finger on it, but I just feel like my muscles are all kind of firing and doing things the way they're supposed to be doing.
Awesome. That's great to hear. All right. So Ben, you're used to Halo Sport 1. We recently launched Halo Sport 2. And for our original users, they will appreciate many of these product improvements. For our new users, they will just take these for granted. So Ben, again, thank you for being one of our early customers. Like, when you get your Halo Sport 2, you'll appreciate some of these product improvements, which, I think are significant. So first and foremost, the electrodes, we call them primers, are much, much better. So the foam has been reformulated so that it really sucks up water better. Mm-hmm. Before, the biggest complaint from Halo Sport 1 users was that it took too long to wet the primers. And that's because of the foam. It just wasn't spongy enough. So the new version of the foam basically solves that problem. Instead of it taking a full minute or two to wet the primer foam, now it's just mere seconds. So that problem hopefully just put to rest with Halo Sport 2. Another is it was just kind of inconvenient to handle 3 different primers. Now, instead of 3 individual primers, it's 1 primer strip. So just a convenience factor, just handling 1 long thing rather than 3 small things. And then, we got a lot of feedback that folks were using our headset as their primary set of headphones. So just FYI to the users or to your listeners, the headset looks like a set of headphones, and they do play music, though the music is not core to our technology at all. And listening to music is completely optional. But when we were hearing from our customers was that they're using it as their music headphones. So with Halo Sport 2, we deliberately leveled up on the music quality. So we worked with acoustic engineers and just really leveled up the acoustic properties of the headset. And also it's natively Bluetooth for music. Before you used to need a audio cable to listen to music. Now you can ditch the cable. Thanks a lot, iPhone. Really appreciate it. So everything's Bluetooth now.
Awesome. One thing I'm very curious about, have you guys seen any kind of synergistic effects, or have you been looking at synergistic effects, whether it be from substances you're ingesting orally, or from sound, or really any other kind of complementary modality where you see an amplification?
It's a great question. So time will tell if there are synergistic effects with different compounds, especially one that you would take by mouth. Ben, the data doesn't exist, but if I could just have some latitude and hypothesize with you, I bet that we will discover synergistic effects. And the reason why is in my prior life, so my time at NeuroPace, which was an epilepsy company, we found that the neurostimulation for these people with epilepsy was synergistic with this particular class of anti-epileptic medication, the so-called sodium channel blocker family of anti-epileptic medication. So that was interesting, and with more scientific study, there's been some I think some pretty well thought out hypotheses as to why that happens. So closer to home, with this specific form of neurostimulation, so back to TDCS, which is what Halo Sport is. So TDCS applied to, so not the motor cortex, this other part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So long name, DLPFC for short. This brain target has been studied for the treatment of depression. And they found several research groups have now found and confirmed that if you stimulate this part of the brain, it can work for the treatment of depression, which is amazing and something we're really curious about. But interestingly, they also found that you can augment the effect of neurostimulation by taking an SSRI. So an SSRI, like we've all heard of this family of drugs. They include Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, so on and so forth. So there's already evidence that shows that you can combine, like a drug in this case, with TDCS and get an augmented effect. So, time will tell, like as we combine neurostimulation with different modalities, like, will there be a synergistic effect or an antagonistic effect? Time will tell if that happens.
Are you able to give us a little bit of insight into what you guys are excited about now, what you guys are studying at Halo Sport?
So the company is Halo Neuroscience. The product is Halo Sport. And we are certainly interested in, building a better motor cortex neurostimulator. So you could expect a Halo Sport 3 to come out from the company, in a few years. There's already ways that we think we can level up on the current product, even though the current product just came out. We're interested in targeting different brain regions. So I alluded to that earlier in this conversation. So there's other brain regions that,
you don't want to divulge.
Yeah, I have to be a little secretive here.
Sure,
but,
that's okay.
But yeah, there's other brain regions that we're really interested in, and we'll design specific products to target that brain region. Mm-hmm. And then, Ben, I want to mention that, as a medical doctor, we're really excited about applying these headsets that, at first come out for consumer applications, but translating that into a medical application. So, for example, with Halo Sport, we're interested in augmenting physical therapy for people who just had a stroke.
Very interesting.
Right. So, like the same principles, like how can we accelerate movement learning? Like we want to help bodybuilders and weightlifters accelerate movement learning for, the new techniques and lifts that they want to perfect. And everybody on the athletic side. What about someone who just had a stroke and needs to practice movement so that they can learn to walk again? Mm-hmm. So there's already some really interesting pilot data looking at this, showing that yes, we can do this. So we as a company want to study this more systematically and appeal to the FDA for approval so that we can market a medical device to help stroke victims. And the list just goes on. For every piece of hardware that initially comes out for a quote consumer application, you could expect the company to also explore medical opportunities with that same piece of hardware.
Have you guys? I think I asked you this, but I don't know that I don't understand the answer. Have you guys acknowledged any energetic implications of exposure to the Halo Sport from brain energy utilization? Have you guys looked at mitochondrial function or ATP production or ATP byproducts or anything along those lines? Or is there anyone that you know
of? No, I don't. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just very curious, but maybe I'll look into it and see if it exists. Well, Dr. Dan, absolutely incredible information. Can't thank you enough for bringing this piece of technology to the world, because I think it's helping a lot of people, and not just from the vain athletic perspective, but also from just optimizing performance. And like I said, I've noticed it tremendously from my training. I've also experimented with it on different parts of my brain. And
oh, you have
secretly, yeah, I have noticing a big difference in certain ability to learn, ability to retain information. I was trying it before reading, before studying. Put it kind of to the back of my brain, to the front of my brain. Tried different places for weeks at a time, and definitively noticed a difference. I mean, if it's the type of thing where if you had kind of a full head helmet, it'd probably be a customer as well, just to experiment with what it looks like in different places.
Oh, I love it. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me. This has been a fantastic conversation. And, I appreciate you asking those tough questions, because I think the best dialogue is an open and thoughtful and just really transparent. And I really enjoyed this.
And where can the listeners go and pick up their Halo 2?
Yeah, so Halo Sport 2 is, we're recording this podcast in April, so maybe by the time this podcast airs, the product will be available for like basically a live product. So right now, as we speak, it's only available for pre-sales,
Got
but
it.
very
What's the
soon.
launch date?
Yeah, so very soon, just in like a 4 or 6 weeks, we'll have enough stock to just like if you order it today, you'll have it in 2 days. Yeah. And that,
Very cool.
yeah, that's haloneuro.com. Really easy, haloneuro.com.
Awesome. And Dr. Dan, you have my stamp of approval. Like I said, I'll be one of your first customers for this one as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to everything you guys do in the future.
All right. Thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much for tuning into Muscle Intelligence. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with at least one person you know, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pekulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest and products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.